The moon hung low over the ancient forest, its pale light barely piercing the twisted canopy. The trees were gnarled, their bark blackened as if burned in some forgotten fire, and the air carried a scent of rot and something older, something foul. The villagers never ventured here after dark, not even the bravest hunters. They whispered of shapes moving between the trees, of laughter that wasn't human, of the thing that lurked in the heart of the woods, Pan, the great god, the goat of the shadows. Elias had heard the warnings, but desperation drove him forward. His daughter, Miriam, was dying. No healer could cure her. No prayer to the church's God had lifted her suffering. But the old stories spoke of another power, one older than the church, older than men, a power that could heal for a price. He had hesitated, his hands shaking as he stood at the village's edge, staring into the abyss of the trees. But as Miriam's fever worsened, as her breath grew shallow, his fear became a forgotten thing. Now he was here, his lantern flickering against the suffocating darkness. Every step forward felt like stepping into another world, a place where men did not belong. The silence was thick, unnatural. No wind stirred the leaves, no insects chirped. Even the rustling of his own boots against the leaves seemed muffled, swallowed by the forest itself. He felt watched. He reached the clearing as the stories described, a circle of blackened stones, the ruins of something that had existed before the village, before men had given this land a name. The air was heavy with an odor, something like damp earth and spoiled wine. The stones, though crumbled, pulsed with an eerie warmth. Elias hesitated before stepping inside. He had prepared the offering, a rabbit, its throat freshly cut, its blood still warm. He knelt and let the blood pool into the hollow of a stone, whispering the words he had stolen from an old, forbidden book, words that made his tongue feel swollen, wrong in his mouth. The air shivered. Then the silence was broken. A flute began to play, high and shrill, twisting through the trees like a living thing. It did not come from one direction, but from everywhere at once. Elias shuddered, his fingers digging into the damp earth. His heart pounded as the music rose, shifting from melody to discordant screeching, a sound that felt like fingers raking against his mind. And then something stepped forward. It was not a man nor a beast. It was both and neither, its body half concealed by shadows that moved unnaturally, as if they lived. Its head bore the curling horns of a goat, but its face was something else entirely, something that shifted and changed, too fast to grasp, too terrible to comprehend. Elias opened his mouth to beg, but the words shriveled on his tongue. The god grinned. The grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. Elias wanted to look away, but something in the creature's gaze held him in place, a force far greater than mere fear. The flute's shrill notes twisted around him, each one a needle pressing into his mind. His body locked in place, rigid, barely able to breathe. The god took a step closer, and the trees bent as if bowing to its presence. Its hooves left no mark on the earth, but the ground pulsed beneath them as if in pain. Elias could feel it. This was not a mere spirit, not a mere legend. This was something vast, something ancient, something that should never have been disturbed. The god knelt, its face inches from Elias's. Its breath smelled of wine and rot, of damp stone and the deep earth. The thing's eyes, slitted like a goat's, glowed with an eerie green light, their depths swirling like a storm. It studied him, its expression unreadable, both cruel and amused. "You called," it said. Its voice was a sound Elias had never heard before, a harmony of whispers and screams layered upon each other. The words did not pass through the air. They were in his head, burrowing, curling, pressing against the soft places of his mind. "You know the price." Elias swallowed, forcing his throat to work. "My daughter," he croaked. "She is dying." The god laughed. The sound was beautiful and hideous all at once. The music of joy twisted into something obscene. The air trembled with it, the trees swaying though there was no wind. "Yes," it murmured, its voice wrapping around him like ivy, tightening. "I know." Elias shuddered. He had expected a demand, gold, a sacrifice, his own life, but the god only watched, waiting, its grin never fading. He understood then, it did not need to ask for the price. The price was already set. "What must I do?" His voice was barely a whisper. The god tilted its head, its ears twitching. "Give me your fear," it said. "Give me your mind, your sight, your soul." Its fingers, long, too long, caressed Elias's cheek, cold and burning at once. "I will leave the shell intact." A scream built in Elias's throat, but he bit it back. He had come this far. Miriam was all that mattered. I accept. The god's grin widened. The flute's music grew louder, spiraling into something unbearable, drilling into his skull. The trees around him twisted, their forms melting into grotesque shapes, writhing, pulsing. The ground beneath him rippled as though alive. Then the god placed its hands on Elias's head. Pain exploded behind his eyes. Not pain, something worse. A shattering. He did not have time to scream. Elias fell, or he thought he did. There was no ground beneath him, only an endless abyss of color and shadow, shifting and writhing like something alive. The pain was unbearable at first, an invasion, a violation of everything he was. His thoughts unraveled, his memories torn apart like rotten cloth. He saw flashes. Miriam, burning with fever, her tiny hands clutching at the sheets. His wife, long buried, her face already half forgotten. His own childhood playing in the fields, laughing in the sunlight. And then they were gone. He floated in a void that was not a void, where shapes formed and dissolved like ink in water. Strange things moved in the darkness, things he could not name, could not comprehend. He glimpsed faces, or what might have been faces, but they shifted too quickly, their forms twisting, melting, reforming into horrors beyond reason. The flute still played, but now he understood. It was not music, it was the sound of something laughing. The god was inside him now, it whispered, its voice curling through his bones, twisting into the hollows of his mind. Do you see? Elias did. The world was a mask, a fragile illusion stretched over a writhing chaos of things that should not be. The trees, the sky, the village, everything was a lie, a thin veil over the truth. He saw beneath it now, and what lay beneath was madness. Shapes that had never been given names, things older than man, older than gods, moving beneath the skin of the world. They pulsed, they watched, they fed. He tried to scream, but he had no mouth. Then, suddenly, he was back. The clearing reformed around him, but it was different now. The trees still loomed, but their shapes seemed wrong, like crude imitations of trees, as if something had sculpted them without truly understanding what a tree was. The sky above was too dark, too vast, and something moved within it. Elias felt light, hollow. He touched his face, his arms, his chest. He was whole, but he was not the same. He turned, and the god was still there, smiling. Go, it whispered. Elias stumbled back, his legs weak. The music had stopped, but its echo remained in his skull, a ghost of a sound that would never leave him. He did not remember walking back through the forest. He did not remember reaching the village. But suddenly, he was home. Miriam lay on the bed, still and quiet. He rushed to her, his hands trembling as he touched her forehead. Cool, not burning. Her breath was slow but steady. She was healed. Elias let out a sob of relief. Then Miriam's eyes fluttered open, and the god had left something inside her. Miriam's eyes were not hers. Elias had seen those eyes before, deep, slitted, shifting like liquid shadow. For a moment she simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled. Not a child's smile, not Miriam's smile. The world swayed. Elias gripped the edge of the bed, his stomach twisting as something cold slithered up his spine. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The god was still watching him, still inside his mind, even now. Miriam? His voice barely escaped his throat. She blinked. When her eyes opened again, they were normal, soft brown, innocent. She stretched her arms with a quiet yawn, rubbing the sleep from her face. Papa, she murmured, her voice small, drowsy. Elias felt his knees buckle. He grabbed her hand, pressing it between his own. Warm. Alive. She was alive. He forced a smile, but it felt wrong on his face. I'm here, he whispered. Miriam's lips curved into a sleepy grin. I had a dream, she said, her voice still thick with sleep. A funny dream. His heart pounded. What kind of dream? She hesitated, her small fingers tightening around his. I don't remember. A pause. But there was music. The words sent ice through his veins. Miriam yawned again and snuggled deeper into the blankets. Within moments, she was asleep once more, her breath slow and even. Elias sat beside her, shaking. The god had given him what he wanted. Miriam was whole. She was healed. But something else was here now, watching. Waiting. He turned to the window. The forest loomed in the distance, dark and motionless beneath the cold moonlight. It no longer looked like trees, not to him, not anymore. He could see the shapes beneath. They had always been there. And now they were watching him too. Elias did not sleep that night. He sat in the chair beside Miriam's bed. his fingers gripping the arm so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The house was silent except for the faint sound of her breathing. It should have comforted him. It didn't. The forest still called to him. Though the walls of his home separated him from the trees, he could feel them pressing in. The shapes beneath the world, the ones that had always been there but that he had never seen before. Now they stirred. They whispered without words, moving beneath the skin of reality like worms beneath the earth. And the god Pan was inside his mind, curled deep in the place where Elias's thoughts should have been safe. Miriam shifted in her sleep. Elias tensed. She made a sound, a soft, high giggle, a sound that did not belong to her. His breath caught in his throat. He leaned closer, his pulse hammering. Miriam's lips moved, but the words she spoke were not words at all. They were sounds, broken fragments of something too ancient to belong to human tongues. He knew them. He had spoken them himself in the clearing, the offering, the words that had called Dit forth. His hands clenched into fists. Miriam. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. She stilled. The room was too quiet. Slowly, her eyelids fluttered open. For the briefest second, they were wrong. Slitted pupils, shifting darkness, something watching from deep within. Then she blinked, and the illusion was gone. She yawned, rubbing her eyes. "Papa?" Her voice was soft, groggy, normal. Elias swallowed hard. "Go back to sleep, my love." Miriam smiled drowsily and rolled over, burying herself beneath the blankets. Within moments, her breathing evened out again. Elias sat motionless, staring at her. He told himself it had been a trick of the light, the remnants of exhaustion twisting his thoughts. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something had come back with her. Or worse, she was no longer alone inside her own body. He rose from the chair with slow, mechanical movements, his limbs heavy. The wooden floor creaked beneath his steps as he moved to the door. He hesitated before glancing back one last time. Miriam lay peacefully, her small chest rising and falling in rhythm with her breath. But as Elias turned away, he heard something, a whisper, too faint to catch, too soft to belong to her. The god was not done with him yet. The whisper lingered in the air long after Elias left Miriam's room. He closed the door gently behind him, pressing his forehead against the wood, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. His hands trembled. He had done this. He had brought something back. The floor beneath him felt unstable, as though the world itself had shifted beneath his feet. The house, his house, no longer felt like his own. The walls seemed too close, the shadows stretching too far. The lanterns flickered despite the absence of wind. The silence was wrong. He moved toward the hearth, throwing more wood onto the embers, watching as the flames licked hungrily at the dry bark. The warmth should have comforted him, but it did not chase away the cold that had settled deep inside his bones. Somewhere outside, in the depths of the forest, a flute played. Elias stiffened. The sound slithered through the cracks in the windows, curling around him like smoke, filling his ears, his lungs, his mind. It was faint, just a whisper of melody, but it was enough. The god was calling. His vision swam. He gripped the edge of the wooden table, his nails digging into the grain. The song was inside him now, writhing through his thoughts like a living thing. He clenched his teeth against it, but the music did not care. It was not asking, it was commanding. Elias stumbled toward the door before he even realized he was moving. His hand gripped the iron handle, his body acting on instinct, not his own, but something else's. The god's presence loomed behind him, unseen, but there, filling every corner of the house, coiled deep within his skull. He could not fight it. The door swung open. Cold night air rushed in, but it was not just the wind. The forest itself breathed. The trees swayed, though there was no storm. The sky above was too dark, the stars sharp and wrong, twisting in unfamiliar constellations. The world was shifting. Something stood at the edge of the trees, a shadow, neither man nor beast. Its outline pulsed, shifting between forms, never solid, never stable, but the horns remained, the grin remained. The god was waiting. Elias tried to step back, but his body did not obey. The song filled his veins, pulling him forward, step by step. Come. The whisper was inside him, thick as blood. Behind him, from within the house, another sound echoed, a giggle, Miriam's voice. But it was layered now. Two voices where there should be one. Elias turned his head just slightly, just enough to see the figure standing in the doorway. Miriam, smiling, and something else smiled with her. Elias's breath hitched. His daughter stood in the doorway, wrapped in her nightgown, her small hands clutching the fabric as if she had just woken. The lantern light cast flickering shadows across her face, making it hard to see her clearly. But her smile was wrong. It was too wide, too knowing. Something ancient hid behind it, something that should not have been inside her. "Miriam," he choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head, and for a brief moment her features seemed to flicker. Just a trick of the light, surely. But Elias saw it. He felt it. The thing in the woods let out a breath, though it did not move. The flute's melody shifted, its notes spiraling higher, wrapping around the night like a serpent. The pull in Elias's chest grew stronger. Miriam took a step forward, barefoot on the cold wooden floor. "Papa," she said, her voice soft, childlike, but not hers. There was something else behind it, something older, layered beneath the sweet, innocent tone. "Go inside," he rasped, forcing the words out, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's late." She didn't move. Instead, she looked toward the trees, toward the shifting, pulsing thing that waited there. And then she did something that made Elias's stomach turn to ice. She laughed. Not the laugh of a child, no. This was something else, something high and lilting, something that echoed. Elias staggered back, his pulse hammering. "Miriam," he begged now, "please, come back inside." Her eyes flicked to him, and for a single, unbearable second, they were no longer hers. Goat-slit pupils, green like rotting leaves, 1,000 shifting faces in the black pits behind them. Then they were brown again. She sighed, almost as if she were disappointed. "You called him," she whispered. "You let him in." Elias's mouth went dry. The god in the trees took a step closer. The ground beneath its hooves did not crunch, did not stir. It simply accepted him. Miriam watched Elias, her expression unreadable. Then she slowly reached out a hand, palm up. "Come, Papa." His body lurched forward before his mind could protest. No. No, no, no. But it was useless. The music was inside him now, pulling, pulling, pulling. Miriam's hand was small and warm when he took it, and the moment he did, the forest swallowed them whole. The moment Elias stepped into the forest, the world changed. The trees, towering and ancient, twisted unnaturally, their bark pulsing like something alive. The branches stretched out, curling toward him like grasping fingers. The ground beneath his feet was not earth, not leaves, but something soft, something that pulsed and shifted with each step. It breathed. The air was thick with the scent of damp moss, of decay, of something sweet and rotten all at once. The flute's melody was no longer distant. It was everywhere, inside his head, beneath his skin, thrumming in his bones. Miriam still held his hand, leading him deeper. But was it still Miriam? She walked with a strange grace, her bare feet unbothered by the shifting, pulsing ground. Her small fingers curled around his own, firm, insistent. She never looked back. Elias tried to stop. He tried to dig his heels into the earth, to wrench his hand away, but his body did not obey. The song had bound him, had woven into his flesh, his veins. The trees loomed closer, their bark split open, and eyes, dozens of them, watched him. Human eyes. Goat eyes. Eyes with too many pupils, swirling with color and madness. They blinked in unison. A soft chuckle echoed from the darkness ahead. And then he was there. The god, Pan. It stood at the center of the clearing where the trees arched unnaturally, forming a twisted cathedral of bone-white branches. The thing was tall. Impossibly tall, its form shifting like a mirage. It was man and beast and shadow, all at once. Its horns spiraled upward, jagged and cracked like ancient roots. And its grin, that grin. Elias wanted to look away, but the god's gaze held him. It lifted the flute to its lips and played 3 short notes. Elias gasped as his knees buckled. Something inside him tore. His mind twisted, unraveling, unspooling into the night like threads of silk. And then he saw. The truth. The world as it really was. The thin veil of reality ripped away. The earth beneath him was no longer earth. It was flesh, stretching endlessly, pulsing like the inside of some great living thing. The sky was no sky at all, but a vast open wound, a mouth gaping wide. And the shapes, the ones he had glimpsed before, were everywhere. They slithered between the trees, laughing, singing, whispering. Things with too many arms, too many eyes, too many smiles, things that had been waiting. Elias opened his mouth to scream. But Miriam turned to him, her face wrong, shifting. She smiled, and when she spoke, it was with his own voice. "Do you see now, Papa?